Good morning. My name is Patrick Carr, and I'm here to introduce the next keynote speaker, T. Scott Plutchak. Scott is currently the Director of Digital Data Curation Strategies at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where he works to develop institutional policies and services for the management and curation of research data. And this is actually the second time that I've had the pleasure of introducing a presentation of Scott's. The first was about a decade ago when Scott gave a keynote presentation at a library workshop that I helped to organize at Mississippi State University. And I still really remember being engaged by that presentation. And since then, I've had the opportunity to interact with Scott again when I was helping to edit an issue of the journal Against the Grain, in which Scott contributed an excellent piece exploring the legacy of Nicholson and Baker's famous, and some would say infamous, book critiquing library deselection practices, The Double Fold. Through these interactions and through reading his blog, I've come to recognize Scott as a thought leader and as an information professional with rare insights into the challenges and opportunities inherent to the evolving information ecosystem that we're all navigating through. But before I introduce Scott, just one quick note. If you don't have a handout, you can get one in this room. I believe they're on a chair there. So I'll go ahead and introduce Scott. Please give a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. You make me blush. This notion of being a thought leader is a little scary. So how is everybody? You're all a little bit more coffeeed up, right? Ready to go into the next thing. Well, I want to echo what Jane had to say about congratulations to the organizers of this joint meeting of NASIG and SSP. I think this is really fabulous. Jane mentioned that she and I have been involved with groups over the years who have really worked to try to bring all the parties of the scholarly communication community together to really learn from each other and work from each other. And I think this particular event is a really signal achievement in that. Jane also set me up nicely for what I'm going to try to talk about, because as I think about the impact of policy on library land, it seems to me that the most significant thing that we're looking at right now are the public access policies coming out of the federal funding agencies. And this has been percolating for a long time, but those policies are now starting to be made public. And I believe that they're going to have a huge impact on how libraries think about what we do, how we interact with our institutions, particularly in higher education. But I really think this is going to percolate throughout library land in many ways and is going to become a defining element for us. We know, for example, data is the new bacon. So Jane referred to that. That's sort of the hot buzzword. I just came from the Medical Library Association conference, and there were, I think, 19 different papers talking about data and what libraries were trying to do to deal with data. So mostly I'm going to focus on that side of things, a little bit about publications, try to give a fairly idiosyncratic view of my sense of how the policy landscape has developed, what I see some libraries doing to try to position themselves, and then a little bit about what I see as some of the challenges and opportunities. By way of background, I come from University of Alabama at Birmingham, sort of a mid-sized urban university, but with a very strong biomedical research bent. So at the end of 2014, we were 10th in public universities in NIH funding. It's a full comprehensive university, so we have research programs all across the disciplines, but we're very, very heavy in NIH, so we pay a lot of attention to what comes out of the federal funding agencies in general, but NIH in particular. For 19 years, I was the director of the Lister Hill Library of the Health Sciences, one of the larger academic medical libraries in the country. And then last fall, as the result of a variety of issues, including some reorganizations, I had an opportunity to move out of the library and into the provost's office, where we cooked up this fancy title for me, which I've now spent the last 6 or 7 months trying to kind of sort out what this actually means. And in essence, I think as Patrick alluded in the introduction, what I am attempting to do is work with the various entities of the university to try to sort out how do we need to think about the infrastructure, the services, and the policy that are really required for a research institution to really figure out how to effectively manage research data, and to do it in this environment where we are being beset with mandates, particularly from the funders, but from a wide variety of other entities. Now, my sense is that in library land, there has been certainly an interest in data over the last decade or two, but it has been very much overshadowed by the public access, open access, publication side of things, which is the stuff that we're mostly familiar with. Interest in data has percolated along. It has started to get more impetus over the last few years, and these new policies, I think, are really going to drive that. But concern about data has been out there for a long time. NIH developed their first data sharing policy back in 2003. And this is from the policy paper, and it sort of lays out the reasons that we want to think about making data open in the first place. That it enables us to test out new hypotheses, to do some error checking, to improve replicability, to do things with the data that we were never able to do in the pre-digital era, when once a particular project was done, the data that had been generated for that essentially disappeared. It went into files, it went into somebody's desk drawer, and we were not able to do anything. Now we can start to think about data in new ways and really make new use of it. But the NIH data sharing policy was pretty thin. It applied only to grants that were $500,000 or more in direct costs, and you had to include a paragraph or two in your grant application indicating what kind of data you were collecting and how it might be shared. So it didn't have a big impact on institutions because of the dollar threshold. Nobody was really too concerned about auditing, was anybody going to check it? If I had that in there something, it was going to be okay. So it didn't get a whole lot of attention in the library community. What certainly got a lot of attention was when NIH made the public access policy mandatory. With this, if you were publishing articles based on NIH-funded research, you had to make sure that a version of that article was deposited in PubMed Central. That certainly got the attention of libraries in the biomedical sphere. It certainly got the attention of any of the publishers in the room who publish a fair amount of that kind of funded research. And a lot of work has been done over the last few years in developing workflows at various levels to try to figure out how to enable researchers to comply with the policy in as painless a way as possible, although anybody who has been involved in this from any angle knows that painless is not a term that anyone would use to describe these processes. Then in 2011, NSF developed their data management policy requirements. This then started to get the attention of libraries that may not have been as invested in NIH, but institutions that had a lot of NSF funding, because now you had to have a data management plan of sorts for every NSF application. Again, not a real detailed plan, but researchers and offices of sponsored programs started trying to figure out, well, what do we need to do? What does this mean? What do I need to put in the grant application? And some libraries saw this as an opportunity to start to provide information, provide assistance, and there were a variety of activities that we saw supporting this. One of the most impressive was the development of the data management planning tool, which was done by the California Digital Library. This is essentially a set of templates that are geared towards every funding entity, governmental, non-governmental, that has some kind of a data management plan requirement. It's publicly available. Anybody can use it in its native form. You can also do a branded version for your own institution to add particular requirements. So it's a really, really nifty project that, although started at the California Digital Library, lots of other librarians have helped participate in it. And it's a very, very effective way for a library that wants to start to provide some of this kind of support to use this tool. So we've got a couple of these things happening. And then part of my particular involvement in the policy development goes back to 2009 with the Scholarly Publishing Roundtable. In 2009, the NIH public access policy had been made mandatory, and there was a lot of advocacy to try to establish legislation that would make similar policies mandatory for all of the other federal funding agencies. There was equally loud and stringent pushback from elements who were very concerned about the unintended consequences of this kind of legislative action. And in Congress and in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the staff people who were trying to figure out how to craft sensible policy were having trouble trying to figure out what the facts really were, how to get through the noise of all of the advocacy, and try to actually craft policy. So at the request of Congress, the Scholarly Publishing Roundtable was formed. A very small group, chaired by John Vaughan, who was the executive vice president of the American Association of Universities, 3 university provosts, 3 librarians, representatives from 4 publishers, big, small, open access society, and then a research team. And we met to try to see if we could come up with a consensus view of what should really inform federal policy in this area. And we delivered our report to Congress and the White House in January of 2010. And I think there's a lot in the report that is still of value and worth looking at. You can find it on the Association of American Universities website. But the key recommendations in the report were that we all agreed that better and more public access to the results of federally funded research was very, very important. But we also felt that given the very uncertain nature of the times, given how much we didn't know, given the differences among disciplines, that a single legislative approach was really not the best way to deal with this. And so what we suggested is that under the guidance of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the individual agencies should work with their constituent groups to develop flexible policies that could be tested and could be modified over time. So that report goes out in January 2010. At the end of that year, December of 2010, incorporated into the America Competes Act, which is one of these great big bills that provided a lot of funding and a lot of guidance for supporting science and technology, education, and investment. So there's a couple of lines in there that basically from Congress then instruct OSTP to do what the recommendation had told them to do. So now OSTP has a congressional mandate to do what OSTP wanted to do. This is the way the government works. This then percolates along, and a little over 2 years later, we get what is often referred to as the Holdren Memo, the OSTP Memo, the Public Access Memo. And here we now have the head of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy instructing the federal agencies to work with their constituent groups to develop public access plans for publications and data. And they are supposed to deliver those plans to OSTP within 6 months, so fall of 2013. Once that memo comes out, that kicks off a lot of activity and a lot of interest, because now we're really going to have some level of public access to publications and to data, which many people have been advocating for a long time. And now we're all trying to figure out what are the agencies actually going to do, and how do we position ourselves to best take advantage when these policies start coming out. Two of the most significant issues, projects that come out, Chorus, which was a collaboration among a number of publishers to come up with systems that would provide public access to funded research on the publisher sites, comes out, and then a collaborative project among the American Association of Universities, Association of Research Libraries, and the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, SHARE is developed, which is intended to kind of leverage the investment in institutional repositories to see if that would be a way of meeting the policies as the policies come out. What has happened over the last couple of years, both of these efforts have developed, I think, beyond those initial ideas, have gotten very sophisticated, and one of the things that pleases me in particular very much is they've really started to see ways that they are complementary and can work together. I think many observers 2 years ago saw these as competing issues. Here was the publisher's project, here was the library side project, and they would battle each other, and we would try to figure out which one won, and it was that same kind of divisive stuff that my view is that does nobody any good. But we've now seen a lot of working together. In fact, Howard Ratner, the current president of SSP, is the CEO of the nonprofit that manages Chorus, and he's also on one of the working groups for SHARE. So there are really some linkages happening there, and I think that's going to develop in very interesting ways. So at the same time that those big projects are going on, we're also seeing libraries looking at, okay, how do we position ourselves? And what are we really talking about when we're talking about research data anyway? One of the things that has become very apparent to me over the time that I've been really working on this full time now is, as contentious as the issues around open access to publications have been, publications are easy. Data is a real beast. We at least know what publications are. They're static entities. We've spent our professional lives figuring out how to work with them. Data is messy, it's diverse, it is dynamic. So just trying to get your arms around what data is to think about making it available is really difficult. The OSTP memo attempts to kind of get their arms around it and to say we're really focusing on the data that is typically considered to be that which supports the conclusions of research articles. So there's a lot of stuff that gets generated during a research project that we're not interested in, so it's not everything. But even within this frame, as you start to dig into some really complicated big data projects, it's still tremendously complicated and huge. So libraries are attempting to track what's happening from the policy standpoint. This is a crowdsourced document that a number of libraries are working together to try to develop. Is there anybody in the room who has worked on this? I'm just curious. Okay. This is really attempting to track the different policies as they come out, because again, the advantage to having the agencies do their individual policies is we've got that flexibility, we've got different ideas out there. The problem, of course, is that we've got all this flexibility and we've got all these different ideas out there, and we have to figure out how to track them. And if you're in an institution, like mine, for example, where you've got some big research projects that are funded by multiple agencies, you're now faced with PIs who are going to have to figure out, okay, how many different places do I need to put my publications and my data in order to satisfy the mandates of all these different agencies? So work is now being done to try to track this. But to give you an example, look at a couple of the policies. National Institutes of Health, publications have to be deposited to PubMed Central. They've got that down, so we're solid with that. Data is a lot more complicated for NIH because all of the institutes have their own needs and requirements anyway. There's been a genomic data sharing plan for a long time. There's been clinicaltrials.gov dealing with clinical data. But now all the agencies have to come up with something, and there has to be some kind of a coordinated policy. And NIH claims in their recently released documents that they're going to have these requirements in place by the end of the calendar year. And so when we get into the fall deadlines, anybody with an NIH application is going to have some kind of a data management plan as part of that. This is really starting to get the attention of the offices of sponsored programs, and it is a great opportunity for libraries to start to get in there and say, we can help pull this information together. We have some resources to start to help the research community. Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which is another HHS organization. I am going to get through this presentation without tripping over too many of the acronyms. They're also using PubMed Central. All the HHS organizations are. But they're going to contract with a third party for the data deposit. They haven't decided which one. They haven't provided very much guidance into what you need to do with your data to deposit it in terms of metadata. But again, they're going to have this all in place by October. They promise. Energy has taken a completely different approach. For them, publications, they're going to rely on Chorus. So if you're publishing with somebody who participates in that, you're taken care of. If you've got a good institutional repository that meets certain requirements, you're okay. Failing that, Energy is going to set up their own repository called Pages that you can put in there. So a little bit more complicated for somebody who's funded from Energy to figure out what's the right thing. And then again, they're going to require a data management plan. There's going to be some requirements to this. If you look and read through all the policies as they're coming out, and you go through the 20 or 25 pages of small print about their data management plan, I don't think it is entirely unfair to say that a lot of it boils down to, we are going to have a plan, damn it, and it's going to be a really good one. And we're going to have it by the end of the year. So, just to complicate the matter further, of course, it's not just the federal funding agencies. It's the other funding agencies. Gates has a plan, HHMI has a plan, and the publishers are developing their plans. So now the research community is getting it on both sides. You're going to have a data management plan when you apply for funding. And then when you are looking at publishing your research, you've now got to figure out what does the journal that I want to get into require in terms of sharing or depositing data, and what are the resources at my institution to try to make sure that I've got the pieces in place, infrastructure, policy, and services to be able to do this. So we're starting to see this activity in higher education around the country as people are trying to figure out what is it that we need to do, how do we do it, and in many cases, in most cases, from the institutions that I've been looking at, it really is the libraries that are taking the lead in trying to gather this information, in trying to provide some guidance and some resources to the research community. The Association of Academic Health Sciences Libraries, working with the University of South Carolina School of Medicine Library, has developed a guide to guides. So a way to go in and see what different libraries are doing to try to track this. And as you go to the websites, you see a variety of different setups. So Wisconsin has their research data services. And again, you'll see writing a data management plan, but then best practices on managing data, information about the particular institutional requirements. VCU has a similar thing, research data management. They look at the data life cycle. What you tend to see in looking at what libraries are doing, support for developing data management plans is sort of at the top of the list. And then you may have some best practices about managing data in general. You know, don't keep all of your data on a flash drive in your drawer. The role of institutional repositories. Institutions that have a big institutional repository are looking to see, is this going to be an appropriate home for the data of my research community. Again, it seems to me that most of the institutional repositories that have been developed to deal with publications are not really well set up to deal with data. Plus, depending on the discipline and project you're in, it may actually make more sense to store your data in some non-institutional collaborative project. So just figuring out where the data goes becomes very complicated. A lot of libraries are using this as a way to leverage participation in ORCID, sort of look at the whole process of managing research. People are recognizing that ORCID becomes a really fundamental building block, and so putting programs in place to try to get as much of your research community as possible registered with ORCID becomes something that libraries can really push. UNC, again, has a similar kind of setup. Carnegie Mellon. So you see across the board libraries learning from each other, trying to figure out how to take what they see other folks doing and then tailoring it to their own particular institution. And then there are things like the Journal of eSciences Librarianship out of the University of Massachusetts, scholarly peer-reviewed journal that is attempting to really start to report research that is coming out about how libraries are responding to this, what works, what doesn't. Lots of really good stuff over the last, I think, 3 years they've been up and running. A really valuable resource for finding out more about this. Most of the stuff in this area, of course, is in the science, technology side of things, but there is a whole parallel movement through the digital humanities. And even, I think NIH, for example, is not does not fall under the OSTP memo, but they're looking at how do they participate, how do they look at opening up data related to their projects. And we start to see libraries moving into this digital humanities space. So lots of ways in which I see librarians looking at the policy things that are coming down, and is this an opportunity for us to engage with our community in a more direct way, where we can go out and say, look, we see that there is an issue happening that this institution is going to have to deal with if we're going to continue to be competitive, if we're going to continue to play the kind of role we want to play, and we have some of the expertise and some of the talent that can help the institution address some of these issues. But it really has to be done in this institutional context. And too often, I think what I see a library approaching this as looking at, we kind of understand the issue, so we're going to create a set of services, and then we're going to try to figure out how to get the research community to participate. And I think anybody who's been involved in setting up their institutional repository has kind of run into that. We have to not look at this as a library problem. This is an institutional problem. And addressing this requires a collaborative approach among the research folks, the IT folks, libraries, research centers, labs, lots of people across the institution. And that's really, really hard, because our institutions are very siloed. And regardless of what area we're in, we may at best talk nice about the other folks, but really sitting down and figuring out how to work together to address these problems is very hard. And as I talk to my colleagues around the country who are dealing with this is kind of the number one thing that gets raised is, yes, I get it, I've got to work more effectively with IT, I've got to work more effectively with the research office, but it's really, really hard to get their attention. I do think that the federal funder mandates coming out are a great opportunity to get their attention, because this is no longer somebody from the library saying sharing data and open access is a good thing because it's a good thing. We have never been as effective as we would like to be in getting people to buy into that with real time and energy. Now the issue is, if we want to continue to be competitive in the world of grants, we've got to have effective infrastructure, services, and policies in place to provide open data and open access to publications. The second and third challenges, of course, are resources and training. If you really start to look at what it's going to take for an institution to address this in a big way, you are talking about millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars in investment in infrastructure and in people. And I have yet to see an institution that is positioned yet to where they feel they have that level of resource to put into it. And part of it is we're still very much in this experimental phase. We haven't figured out yet what the real answers to these questions are. So the people who are making the financing decision have a lot of trouble deciding that they're going to put $5 million this year into trying to do some things that might or might not work. So what you see in the institutions that are really grappling with this is they've got, 25% of this librarian and 50% of this librarian and 10% of this IT person and some really energetic reference librarian who now has the title scholarly communications librarian on top of everything else that they're trying to do. And we are muddling along with that. And then, even for those people, the training that's required to really do this well. As librarians, the notion of what you can think of as contextualizing information objects, that's cataloging, right? It's taking an information object and putting it into context so you can find it and make sense of it. That's cataloging. That's metadata. So it is intrinsic in the library profession that philosophically we should be able to take that ability and apply it to data. And that sounds really good, but it's really, really hard. And very few people have the kind of training that's necessary to do it. Fortunately, in response to what we're seeing, there are loads of webinars, there are short courses, there are library schools that are starting to dig into this. There are ways to start to get the training. Best practices are in the process of being developed. Standards are in the process of being developed. One of the things that I find most intriguing is the National Library of Medicine has a program that is just about to go into its third round of administrative supplements for what they're calling informationist services. And if you haven't heard the term informationist, it basically means a librarian in context. In the bar sometime I can give you the history of the term, and it wasn't my fault. Essentially what this program does is if you are a PI with a research grant from NIH, and not that the grant has anything to do with libraries, you can get a supplement of $25,000 to hire a librarian and add that person to your grant as part of the research team to help deal with data management issues. NLM is funding this because they want to see what works and what doesn't. When is a librarian in this kind of role effective? As I said, the third round is about to come out. And every time it's come out, more institutes have participated. So more of the NIH directorates are seeing the value of this kind of activity. We are hoping that there will be similar programs developed out of some of the other federal funding agencies. So again, a great opportunity for librarians to get more involved in this kind of work and get more connected to the research teams. So finally, a little bit about what I'm trying to do here at at UAB. My office, as I said, I'm no longer administratively part of the library, but my office is on the top floor of the Lister Library building in an area that is officially called the edge of chaos. Now, I tell my colleagues that after being the director of an academic medical library for 19 years and feeling that I was in the middle of chaos, the fact that I have now moved up to the edge, I find to be quite relaxing. The Edge of Chaos is owned and operated by the School of Public Health, but it is a multidisciplinary center of innovation dedicated to working on wicked problems. Now, wicked problems is not a slang term. Wicked problems actually comes out of the social sciences literature from a couple of decades back, and it refers to problems that are, the boundary space of the problem is difficult to define. You need multiple disciplines to really apply the kinds of expertise to address it. You don't really solve wicked problems, you just kind of move them forward incrementally. So a lot of urban planning problems are wicked problems. A lot of public health problems are wicked problems. And I would argue that trying to figure out how to effectively manage research data at a modern research university is a wicked problem. So it's appropriate that we're addressing this in the Edge of Chaos. The phrase the edge of chaos comes from Stephen Johnson's book a few years ago, Where Great Ideas Come From. And in that book, as Johnson tracks the history of innovation over the last few centuries, he says that true innovation comes when you've got people from different disciplines and different ideas who didn't even know that they had something in common, starting to come together, and they find these collisions where ideas start to bounce off of each other, and just before the whole thing tumbles into chaos, that's where innovative ideas come from. So when the dean of the School of Public Health was setting up this center, he called it the Edge of Chaos. So one of the things that I'm trying to do in the Edge of Chaos, in the spirit of this, is to bring together, to my title, these informal groups that I'm referring to as the data wranglers. And it's based on this notion that all across the institution, there are people who have a very strong interest in some aspect of data management, whether it's a researcher or an IT person or a librarian or a compliance officer. But there isn't anybody who really has the responsibility for looking at it from an institution-wide standpoint. Our organizations aren't set up that way. So what I'm doing is setting up these once-a-month informal meetings, serving beer and wine, and just bringing people together to talk about what drives you nuts, what do you see as the advantages, what would you like to see the institution do. And as an example, in the last one we had a couple of weeks ago, we were able to get a dozen people with a wide variety of expertise. We've got a guy who is a member of the Institute of Medicine and a big OA supporter, a guy who is running what I think is currently the largest multi-institutional longitudinal study on stroke risk, somebody who's an expert in decision support systems, a historian who is doing dialogue mapping, the director of the clinical data warehouse. I mean, a really interesting mix of people with a wide variety of backgrounds. And my job in the middle there is really to kind of be the connector and to really listen to what their issues are and their concerns are, and to try to be, you know, an advocate for everybody, and then try to see how do we bring these interests together and really organically develop a sense of what are the priorities that the institution needs, and within that context, what can the library bring to the table? What does the compliance officer bring to the table? Where might IT focus their energy and be able to move the institution forward as a whole? One of the things that I really like about my current job is it is absolutely insoluble The project is completely huge. I have no resources to apply to it. But every day that I go in and make some little connections like that, it brings the whole thing forward a little bit. And I think, regardless of the institution, and regardless of the size of the library, and regardless of the resources that you have, there's a really great opportunity to kind of insert yourself into this process and figure out ways to make a difference in your institution. The goal is this great quote I really love. If the data you need still exists, if you found the data you need, if you understand the data you found, if you trust the data you understand, if you can use the data you trust, someone did a good job of data management. So that, I think, is what we're trying to do. I think this provides unbelievable challenges to the library community as well as the other entities that make up the research institution. It has to be done, although I haven't talked about that much, very much in collaboration with what the publishers are doing. You know, as Jane said, all of the publishers are starting to figure out what is our role within that as well. So as we're developing services and as we're developing infrastructure, we've got to be thinking about what is that endpoint out there and how do we continue to partner effectively with the publishing community in order to make this whole thing work seamlessly and wonderfully as we move into the future. And I think that's it for me. So thank you very much, and we've got about 10 minutes for questions. That's my granddaughter, by the way. This is my obligatory Josie Bug picture. Yeah.
Thank you, Scott. That was terrific. I was intrigued hearing that you'd just been at MLA with 19 presentations. We were so excited to find you as a speaker because we know you're a great speaker, but we don't know anybody else doing this. So are there other people at the provost office level taking this on?
There really aren't many. I'm in a, and again, I think I alluded to the resources problem, and I think that is part of the issue that we're facing. It was really just a piece of luck with the way a number of things fell into place at UAB that enabled me to move into this. So it is somewhat unusual to have somebody at my level trying to coordinate this activity full time. Now, the flip side to this, as I point out to people, is after 20-some years as a library director, I now have no staff, no budget, but a very supportive boss and complete freedom to set my own priorities. So I was explaining this to somebody, and he said, "It sounds like you're on sabbatical." I went, yeah. I think that what we are going to need in many of these institutions is there is going to have to be somebody fairly highly placed who is responsible for coordinating this. I think it will likely come out of the libraries because it does seem to be librarians who see this need and who see the issues broadly. But then, of course, it means you're competing for all of the other things for your limited resources. So that's going to continue to be a real serious challenge. That being said, there are quite a number of people around the country who are really digging into this and doing some really great stuff. And you can identify them by going to some of those websites, looking at some of the stuff that gets published in the Journal of eScience Librarianship. So those people are indeed starting to emerge and starting to develop a real data librarian community. Hey, Bob.
Hi, Scott. I'm Bob Schatz with Biomed Central, and thank you for a great presentation. A request for a subjective opinion.
That's all I have.
Good. Yours are better than most. Research is incremental. And opening data up will have the benefit of allowing others to examine and use and perhaps tweak that data, or to tie it in with their research that they then morph it into a similar data set, but not identical, yet not entirely unique. And each round and time that that happens, what is predominantly the same data will be replicated, but not entirely the same data. And does this demand or this ever-burgeoning infrastructure of data on data on data that has a lot of similarity collapse eventually by its own weight? Or do you think that there will be more linkages to original data rather than replicating it in one repository after another as the incremental nature of research lives itself out?
If we proceeded rationally, that's a laugh line, we would have something like sort of the original data set and building from that, and clear linkages, and the ability to really look at the provenance of data over projects. I would like to think that we will get there at some point, but we are so much in this kind of Wild West area right now. I think what we are going to have initially is a much more fragmented area. And that is one of the things that concerns some of the researchers, is on the one hand, you may say, yeah, I'm willing to share my data, but if somebody is going to use that and is going to do other work built on it, I still want credit for that. And so how am I going to be able to track that to be sure that I'm still getting credit? That's one concern. And the other is, I don't want somebody using it and misusing it. So even among researchers who are dedicated to the principle of sharing data and having open data, there are some very, very strong legitimate concerns. And again, that's something that is going to be worked out over time. We do not have answers to that yet because we're so early in the process.
Hi, Paul Groth, Elsevier Labs. So I wanted to ask you about talent. So I was at a conference last week for computer scientists, and Google and Facebook had booths and parties and this kind of thing. And I wondered, how are you dealing with kind of a talent drain for these data wranglers? They're in high demand. What are the implications there?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And I would say that there are two pieces to it. I came across, I like the term data wranglers. There's another term that I might like even better, which is data munging. Has anybody heard data munging? Data munging is actually taking that data set and kind of cleaning it up and applying the metadata and shaping it and making it available for somebody else to use. And again, theoretically, that sounds like, yeah, that's what we should do. But it's not just having the talent to be able to do that. It's, well, what is it exactly that we're trying to do? Because we don't really have clear standards for that. So the people who are getting into this are starting to develop the standards in the first place, and then we have to try to train them to be able to apply those standards. It's kind of as if sort of trying to track the age of the audience here. How many of you as librarians worked with AACR2? All right, that's not bad. So try to manage learning to catalog and invent those rules at the same time. That's kind of where we are. But it reminds me, one of the really fascinating conversations that came out from the last Data Wranglers session almost philosophical debate. This is why you serve wine and beer. Between the guy who was running the big stroke study, and we also have an engineer computer scientist who is running a big brain mapping study. And they got into really a philosophical discussion about the limits of metadata. The stroke guy says and maintains, you can never apply sufficient metadata to a data set to ensure that it can be well used by someone who does not have access to the person who developed the data set. He says it can never be done. And so he's very happy to share data. And they have requests coming to his team all the time about people are doing projects, but they prepare a tailored data set analysis for them. He would say that there is no solution to the talent issue because the problems are so huge that you will never be able to have enough people to actually do this. It's going to have to be done within the individual research projects. Brain mapping guy, on the other hand, says, coming out of the computer science world, we apply metadata to big, complicated data sets all the time. And yes, you can never get perfect metadata, but you can absolutely get metadata that is good enough for somebody else to make good use of it. And so they're going back and forth in a very polite way, but in a way that is just fascinating to me as they're trying to sort through what those issues are. But those are the kinds of things that we still really have to resolve, and we don't have a lot of good, widely shared examples of metadata applied to complicated data sets to say, yes, this is really the way you do it across disciplines. We have some good examples in pockets of disciplines, but we don't yet have a really widely shared understanding that this is what you do, and so this is how we train people to become these kind of data wranglers.
Are there any other questions for Scott? All right, well, thank you, Scott.
Okay, thank you all very much.